Great talk, Pat. My name's Ken Cregan. I'm an electrical engineer, and I was inspired by what you had to say about being brave in politics. And often electrical engineers don't tell politicians some things that are rather important. So I want to break my question up into two parts. The first part is a straightforward bit, and then I want to elaborate depending upon your answer. The question is, are you aware of what's happening in Europe with respect to powering electric cars, not with big batteries, but by electrifying the roadway? There's significant standards underway, and companies like Volvo are well involved. Are you across what they're doing in Europe with this?
Not on electrifying the not electrifying the railways. I've seen the roadways.
Electrifying the roads.
Yes. Roads. I've seen concepts developed, particularly for trucks, where they basically have overhead wires and they run almost like a tram, but I haven't seen it for mass transit.
Well, there's a lot of work occurring, and that's what I suspect. Politicians are not aware of what's happening, and you should be, and you particularly, because if you're brave, it offers a lot of work and infrastructure for Australia. And really it's the slot car principle for powering cars, that they're working on how to get power into a car from the roadway. So it links in with the tollways, so you pay for your electricity with your toll. But in particular, for the cars, they do not need an enormous battery that they have to go for, say, 100 kilometres. They only need to go about 10 to 20 kilometres, which cuts down the size of the battery. And this is very important from global warming point of view, because when we're concerned about cutting down waste products, there's a lot of waste products in batteries. So we're about to launch into a scheme of putting big batteries in cars all over Australia, and it's going to be a big industry, but it's going to be a lot of problems with it. Now, what's happening in Europe with companies like Volvo, they're putting infrastructure into the roads so as you can pick up power from the road. So as you drive along, you can charge your battery together with using renewable sources and so on. This means we could develop a totally new manufacturing program in Australia using cars which pick up power from the roadway. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Well, thanks for that. It's a fascinating concept which I'll look into. I'm not sure about the practicalities of it, but I'll keep an open mind on it. I think transport emissions are probably the biggest challenge in our decarbonisation because they're growing quite rapidly. They're 19% of our emissions, and even countries with very aggressive climate change policies are having real problems with it. For example, Germany. I think what we'll end up seeing, unless the idea you suggested proves to be a real breakthrough, is we'll see a combination of parts of the transport fleet being electrified, particularly for driving small distances or in small cars, and then the rise of hydrogen fuel cell cars that are obviously very important for when you need more range or you're a truck. And that offers huge opportunities for us. We announced a huge hydrogen policy a couple of months ago that I had a bit to do with riding. And to give you an example about why it's a great opportunity for us in hydrogen, besides the fact that we can be the world leader in producing the hydrogen, only 10% of Australia's rail network, for example, is electrified. The rest of it, they just run diesel trains. It will be much cheaper to convert that to hydrogen fuel trains, or hydrail as it's talked about, rather than electrifying the entire rail network. And there's some of the infrastructure challenges we have in this country where electrification won't always be the convenient answer. Using renewable hydrogen will be part of the transport solution as well. But I'll look into what you've suggested, and I'll look into Volvo and see what they're doing.
Okay, thanks. Go, Pete.
I want to thank you for a very good talk, but you did mention at one stage that what Labor perhaps lacks is an overriding narrative to show the need for that package of policies that you outlined. Now, I mean, overriding narratives are very important, of course. We're shortly going to get the federal government presenting its budget, and they're going to have a narrative for sure. The economy is going well, and if you stick with us, you'll get more fruits in the form of tax cuts. across the board. So what is your narrative going to be other than a rather more depressive version of that? No, the economy is not doing well, and we're going to have to make some uncomfortable changes, in which there's going to be some winners and some losers. Is that the difficulty in establishing the overriding narrative that you referred to in your talk? The lack of having something that is both intellectually coherent and politically saleable.
Thanks, Frank. And what I was trying to refer to in my remarks was more about the fact that I don't think you'll see a Labor Party or a Labor government with a wholesale sort of critique of the capitalist system. That's what I was talking about, rather than a narrative about what our policy agenda is. I think our agenda, our narrative that we've been trying to develop, and ultimately I think will determine whether we're successful at the election or not, is that the current economy as it's structured isn't delivering for the majority of Australians. And why isn't it delivering for the majority of Australians? Because policies are skewed to increase inequality, to reward a narrow oligarchy that has dominated Australia for so long. Like if you look at the Australian capitalist system, it is a classic case of the rule of duopolies. Like it is the classic concentration of capital. It's a sort of almost a if it's not neo-Marxist, it's certainly institutionalist, in that it's all about power. It's not about free markets. It's about a small number of companies cornering the markets, driving out competition. So we've got 2 supermarkets, 4 banks, a couple pet oil refiners, and that means that they're fat, lazy and dumb, and they're just concentrating on ripping off consumers. And then if you've got a government that's not prepared to take on that particular structure, layering on top of that a real failure to understand what Australians go through every day, and that's the narrative we're trying to combat. So for example, I've got the poorest community in all of New South Wales in my electorate, a place called Windale, which is an entire suburb of public housing. And there's a great community spirit there. It is one of the more optimistic communities I engage with, but it's got entrenched generational poverty and dependence upon government transfers. And we've got to have a narrative about why has that occurred and what we'll do to fix it. And that's why what Chris Bowen has done around negative gearing and dividend imputation and all those things are so significant, because it's not the easy stuff. Like I run Seniors Expo, so I can attest to you, they are policies that attract a lot of criticism, but they're not just tinkering around the edges of things. They're actually saying, well, whose economy is this? Who does it serve? And how do we make sure that it serves the Australian people? And that's the narrative we're going to try and get across. There'll be some political pragmatism, as always, but we're making a huge bet. Like I'm sorry to rabbit on, but this is like I think this is the ultimate question for this election, which is, in every huge, deep, qualitative public polling exercise ever done in this country, when they ask people, would you prefer tax cuts or better government services, the people always say better government services, but very rarely have politicians actually believe them. And we've got an agenda that will raise taxes by cutting down on loopholes that are egregious and benefit the wealthy, in turn to fund better services. And that's incredibly brave, and I'm so excited to be running an election on that agenda. It is the opposite of a small target. It might not be as big a target as some in this room would like us to be, but it is not a small target. And I just love actually going up to people and saying, well, you've got a clear choice at this election between the 2 major parties. Obviously, you've always had choices with other parties, but you can't say that we're the bibsy and bobsy on policies, and I find that invigorating.
Oh, sorry, Pete. That's all right. Okay, next, please.
John Tan. I'm a former journalist from economics journalist from Singapore. Just a few short comments to invite your response. One, I think it was a mistake to blame speculation on Keynesian economics. I think what they did not account for was the oil shock, oil price shock, which really was to blame for the speculation and not Keynesian economics. My feeling is that neoliberalism has definitely failed, and the longer we cling to neoliberalism, the worse it will be. The key is to return to Keynesian principles. As I said, I'm from Singapore, not from China, but I'd like to make some comments about China. I think what China has done is to recognize that free market economics does not work, and is trying to fill in the gaps with state-owned enterprises and state banks. My belief is that it was a big mistake to make the central bank independent, which then followed an inflation targeting strategy, which all it achieved was to inflate the asset bubble, which we now have to live with the consequences. It was a mistake to privatize the Commonwealth Bank, and it was a mistake to say that government should get out of the way of the market, because the market can take care of everything. And I think, as you have suggested, that has not happened. We've had duopolies, we've had cozy corporate relationships. The market has not served the country well, has not created jobs, has not increased pay as should be. Comments?
Thanks very much. You've covered a fair number of issues there, so I'll try and be brief. On stagflation and Keynesianism, the point I was trying to make wasn't so much that Keynesianism caused stagflation, but the traditional Keynesian remedies weren't particularly effective to get us out of stagflation. Like, if you've got very high inflation and high unemployment, it's pretty hard to try and raise inflation more to inflate the economy. On the asset bubble, I think the real cause of the asset bubble was policies around negative gearing, the halving of the capital gains tax, and the fact that those policies by Howard occurred at the same time as a low inflation period was normalised, and I think that led to the asset bubble, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. And I think the way the Reserve Bank operates at the moment, they've got a real challenge, because they've got two goals. They've got to keep underlying inflation between 2 and 3%, but they're also supposed to contribute to full employment. And so they've got a real challenge in that they're diagnosing the problem. So I used to be on the House Economics Committee for about 4.5 years, and we'd have Phil Lowe and the RBA come through every 6 months. And they acknowledge that the greatest crisis facing this country is wages. They acknowledge that. They acknowledge that lack of demand, lack of investment is the problems in this economy, it's not inflation. They've then got to make the next step, which is, at the moment, underlying inflation is outside their 2 to 3% band, it's actually underneath it. So that means that, all things being equal, they should think about reducing interest rates even further. But official interest rates are already very, very low. And there's a question about how much they can actually do, and that's why, as someone who alternates between being an institutional economist and someone who likes Keynesianism, I say lifting public demand is the key way through it, is using fiscal policy as the lever rather than monetary policy is the key issue there. So I think I've tackled most of your issues. On the banks, I think the Commonwealth Bank privatisation, the reason that was so negative is because, again, we have such a concentrated oligarchy in the banking system. So the top 5 banks in Australia, so the big 4 plus Macquarie, have 85% of the market. 85% of the market. In the UK, the top 5 banks have 35% of the market, and in the US, 25% of the market. Doesn't mean you don't still have banking scandals and all the associated problems, but the concentration of our banking sector is even out of step with other Anglo-American economies, and that's a huge problem.
Okay.
Hilary Morrissey. Just interested in your speech about how everything is concentrated in Australia, 2 supermarkets, 4 banks and so on. And the issue of globalisation. I want to know, what does anyone know about the TPP, which was ratified in January, and it's still a secret and no one talks about it? It's going to have a terrible effect. It was written by the big multinationals, basically for themselves. And something I would like to see, are there any plans to stop hollowing out government departments to provide services, but also to stop outsourcing and to start inspecting to make sure that legislation is actually carried out?
Thanks. I'll answer the second question first because that one's pretty easy. Yes, we've got really solid policies there. So we've got announced policies to bring in a lot of contractors that are in the ATO and Centrelink back into the government because the outsourcing has been massive and it's caused very significant problems in both service delivery and, quite frankly, the way government agencies work and cost. Defence is probably the worst example. I used to work in the defence portfolio. There'd be a headcount reduction, which meant that you had less public servants, but then you had contractors doing the same job, getting paid more. But the people were happy because they had fewer public servants. On the market, the TPP and the market concentration, I think trade agreements, and we're just talking about this in the break, have shifted more and more from about simply reducing tariffs to being about integrating the trade regimes, integrating the investment regimes and the policy paraphernalia around medicines, pharmaceuticals, PPPs, and that's really scary. Tariff reductions are contested and obviously people still have strong views about that, but compared to undermining the sovereignty of nations through ISDS, through restrictions on PBS, on evergreening patents, that's much more significant. And you look at what happened with the Philip Morris case, even though we won it, it still cost us millions of dollars. And so our policy, as I said, is getting better. The test is when hopefully someone like me coming back in a couple of years' time if we're in government and actually demonstrating that it is better in action. But it's hugely concerning because we've really got a global economic system where a narrow elite control a lot of the policy levers and just are interested in them. Well, Labor ratified it. We've given commitments about what we'll do around TPP and ISDS, and that will solve the worst parts of the TPP. So our commitment in government is, if we win government, is to negotiate with the 6 countries that had expanded ISDS and the ones that had labour market testing to negotiate with them side letters to remove them, as Jacinda Ardern did from New Zealand. And then obviously the next question, the next test will be if the US come in and bring back in the issues around copyright and intellectual property, what we do then. But we've made commitments around the ISDS and the labour market issues, which were probably the most egregious parts of the TPP.
Okay. You want to come back, Frank?
Coming back for another bite at the cherry. Don't worry, this isn't an oral exam. Particular policies. I mean, it'd be great if you come back in 2 years' time after you've been in government for nearly 2 years and can talk about the policies and what comes next. I'm just wondering if coming down the track is a more comprehensive program that emphasised public investment, even a job guarantee, even universal basic income. Are these matters possible once Labor got established as a government?
You've opened a can of worms there, Frank.
No reporters.
No. We are being recorded though, but that's fine. My private answer is the same as my public answer, which is I'm completely opposed to a universal basic income because what it means in reality is reducing transfer payments to the people who need it the most to give guarantees of some income to people who don't need that money. People can argue that we shouldn't have such a tightly targeted welfare system as we have in this country, and I understand the arguments about the trend in the 80s and the 90s going that way was wrong, but I do disagree in that. I think we should be increasing the generosity of our transfer system while maintaining the targeting. New Start is way too low. It is criminally low, and we need to increase it. We've got a generation of pensioners that are retiring without owning their own homes, and that is a massive problem because obviously the pension was designed to give retirees a level of comfort assuming they'd paid off their home. And I'm quite comfortable with the asset test, and this is part of the debate around franking credits. The current threshold for pension access, if you're in a couple, is $850,000 of assets outside the family home. That I think is a fair level of assets outside the family home to still get access to a part pension. So UBI, I'm not really sold on. I'm happy to have a discussion about it, and there's people who are pretty passionate about it, including the new. I'm not sure what he called. What's Luke's position in the search?
Executive officer.
Yeah, well, Luke Whitington's Mr. UBI. So I often have a good discussion with Luke about it. On the job guarantee, Neil Mitchell obviously not Neil Mitchell, Bill. I don't know, Neil's a radio broadcaster, but yeah. Bill Mitchell's obviously from my hometown university, and it's something that I think we should be working out how to make it practical. But I think that's part of the compact that a modern society should have with people, which is that people should have access to a job or good retraining, not the punitive measures you see with New Start and work for the dollar and everything else. I think that's part of the social compact, which is people should have access to work, and if the fallback is a large public works program, well, that obviously ties into what I'm talking about in terms of increasing public investment and infrastructure as a way of getting out sites secular stagnation. So I think of those two things, I think that one's probably more attractive to me. And I think the real challenge we've got is to convince people, like politics so much just falls to the simplistic. If we can get people at a minimum to stop saying we have to grow the pie rather than divide the pie, I think that will be a successful government. Now that might be a really low target, but I just think if we can get people acknowledging the importance of redistribution, that will be a good first step.
Is there another question? Okay, John, you come back, and I've got one. We'll see how we're going then.
Okay. Can I follow up on Frank's question with a related question? Job guarantee. May I suggest that the central bank should look beyond just interest rate monetary policy. It should look also at balance sheet monetary policy and macroprudential regulations as monetary policy. Many central banks, for example, the European Central Bank, is already talking about balance sheet policy as conventional policy. It's no longer unconventional policy, which is what the US thinks of. May I also suggest that AOC, Alexander Cortez, modern monetary theory, which is central banks printing money, which is balance sheet policy, to help finance government deficits. May I suggest that MMT, meaning quantitative easing, be used to finance government deficits in the form of purchasing government bonds. And some of this bond money can be used to finance infrastructure, which is job creating, and it leaves the country with real assets on its balance sheet. Thank you.
Thanks, John. There's no doubt that quantitative easing has actually made a real massive difference in some of those nations in responding to the GFC. and it does have a place in policy making. I'm not convinced we need it in Australia, to be quite frank. I think we've got comparatively low levels of conventional public sector debt. So public debt, private debt is a real concern, but public debt is projected to peak at about is projected to peak at about 25% of GDP. The OECD average is 75%. So our levels of public debt are still only 1/3 of the OECD average. So quite frankly, if we've got a demand problem and we need to stimulate the economy and we need to look at the government's budget, interest rates are so absurdly low, and you look at the recent write-down in forward bond yields, that I'd just be doing conventional borrowing. I just don't think we need to do those more unconventional things. They have their place, but they have their place more when your public debt is around 100% of your GDP rather than 25%. Like, we can go to the market right now and borrow a ton of money very cheaply to build productive infrastructure that provides jobs, that improves people's quality of life, such as public transport, looking at renewable energy that delivers quality of life and jobs and boosts the balance sheet. And so those more unconventional but legitimate practices, I think we don't need at this stage.
Okay, thanks. Okay, my question is a little bit more along the lines of the details there. So you're involved in infrastructure and in energy and climate change policy. So what would an incoming Labor government really do in terms of spending and targeting the spending in broadly in infrastructure and specifically on climate change and energy?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So you've always got to start with the targets because they guide everything else. So our targets in climate change are to reduce Australia's carbon emissions by 45% on 2000 levels by 2030 and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. They're based on the best advice from the Climate Change Authority about what is an appropriate and reasonable contribution to the global efforts around the Paris Treaty. And part of that process is the most significant investment in renewable energy this country's ever seen. So we're committed to driving 50% renewable energy by 2030, which is achievable. We've got a couple of policy options, but one of them is basically re-injecting $10 billion into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to provide long-term contracts to renewable energy providers to put in place. So we're at about 23% renewable energy now. We can get to 50% by 2030. That's one part of the climate change policy. The beauty of that is by committing to strong local content policies, which we have, that'll create an industry of up to 71,000 jobs a year. So that's really important. The second part of that climate change policy is around the hydrogen economy. Are people familiar with hydrogen and why people are very excited about it? I'll be very brief, but very quick. So hydrogen is sort of like the wonder gas in that as long as you can produce it from carbon neutral or using renewable energy. So to produce hydrogen from renewable energy, you basically electrocute water. You use electrolysis, so you use renewable energy to split open water. You get the H and you get the O. You sell the oxygen to hospitals and other people who need it, and you got the hydrogen. That hydrogen can be transported as liquefied hydrogen, like LNG, or combined with nitrogen from the air as ammonia. And that hydrogen can replace natural gas in power production, in heating and cooking. It can be used in transport in hydrogen fuel cell cars. It can replace coking coal in steel making. It is an essential part of decarbonising the economy, and we've committed $1.1 billion to growing a hydrogen economy in this country. And independent studies think we could create an industry worth 16,000 jobs there. So there's two of our landmark policies. The one that I've been very closely involved in is around just transitions, because we've got parts of the country that are very fossil fuel intensive, and one of the compacts we must have is regions that are carbon intensive cannot bear a disproportionate burden from the transition that is occurring. when I worked at the AMW, we did studies into mass redundancy events. And the rule in Australia is, because we do structural adjustment hopelessly in this country, when there's a mass redundancy event, 1/3 of the workers never work again, 1/3 find worse jobs, 1/3 are lucky enough to find comparable jobs. So we must avoid that. Like, people hold up the closure of the BHP in Newcastle as a model for how this country can do it right. It's complete rubbish. We lost a generation of manufacturing workers in my hometown. Do you know what the biggest structural adjustment policy the federal government put in place then? They funded the renovation of the Newcastle Yacht Club. Not many steelworkers got jobs there, not many steelworkers own yachts. So we're committed to a Just Transitions Authority. We've committed to genuine economic diversification based on the strengths of regions rather than just sugar hits. And we're committed to pooled redundancies, which is really unorthodox in Australia, where, and it's modelled on the German coal mining example, where when a power station closes down, instead of those 400 workers losing their jobs, we will force neighbouring power stations to transfer workers over who want to continue in the industry. So this is all about just transition, so that these regions like mine don't bear a disproportionate share of the burden. We'll be announcing soon our broader climate change policies around the industrial sector, so steel making, aluminium smelting, around the transport sector, around the land sector, where there are huge opportunities. But part of my job, and part of what I'm really enthusiastic about, is if we manage to transition, we can actually reap a massive economic dividend. So besides all those jobs I've talked about in renewable energy and hydrogen, when the world makes a transition to 100% renewable energy, which will happen, we can be the home of low-cost manufacturing again, because we've got the best renewable energy resources in the world. We've just got to keep the industries here and work with them on plans to grow them in the future. And so that's one of my jobs, is managing that transition for those strategic industries. We've obviously got all the materials you need for battery manufacturing and for solar panel manufacturing. And I use this vignette often. 60% of the world's solar PV cells are based on technology developed at the University of New South Wales. But we got bugger all jobs out of it because John Howard was in power and he hated renewable energy. We can't repeat that mistake. So on climate change, we've got a very concrete agenda, which I think is quite brave, given the climate wars over the last 15 years. It's pragmatic, but I'm confident that if we can get in and legislate our agenda and start reducing emissions, the Australian people will realise that it's not whalers, not wiped out, legs of lamb don't cost $100, and we can be more ambitious. But we've just got to get a system in place to start cutting pollution.
Right. Okay. Perhaps if there's any more questions, people want Hillary and then Pat, do come up. We've got plenty of time, so come to the microphone though, because no one will hear you, of course. Okay, that was pretty inspirational, Pat. Very kind.
I was just wondering, Hillary, what's happening with hydrogen at the moment, what companies are interested, what are they doing about it, one, and where are the two, Labor's planning to build two solar panel manufacturing plants as state-owned, where are they going to be, what detailed plans?
Thanks, Hillary. On the second part, we haven't committed to building solar rooftop PV manufacturing factories. There are some battery manufacturing facilities that are one was opened in Adelaide, courtesy of the Wetherill Labor government, and there's an electric vehicle manufacturer that's opening in the Latrobe Valley, courtesy of the Andrews government. But we don't have specific policies in that area, and quite frankly, I don't think we'll be competitive manufacturing solar PV cells, because the economies of scale have been just so massive that I don't think we will compete in that part of it. But other parts, for example, wind turbines and wind blades are getting so big right now that there's a stronger argument for manufacturing them onshore rather than in centralised positions, just because they're so massive and difficult to transport. On hydrogen, you can manufacture hydrogen three ways. The cheapest way at the moment is out of natural gas. You can do it out of coal as well, called coal gasification, or through renewable energy. Out of natural gas and coal will only work if you perfect and invest in carbon capture and storage, which is unlikely, it's not impossible. So to give you the most likely example of where that could work is there's a project being undertaken in the Latrobe Valley right now to gasify brown coal and then pump the carbon that's released into the Bass Strait, into the depleted gas wells in the Bass Strait. That's quite close to the Gippsland. They're geologically secure. But there's a real issue about whether it will be cost competitive in long term versus renewable energy that obviously doesn't have those issues. Our main customers will be Japan and South Korea because they don't have the renewable energy resources, so they want to convert to hydrogen. In fact, the Tokyo Olympics will be the hydrogen Olympics, and they've said from 2030 onwards they will not accept any hydrogen that is not carbon neutral. So it's either got to be renewable or with carbon capture and storage. So one part of our $1.1 billion policy we announced was around hydrogen guarantees of origin. So we'll run a program that will stamp hydrogen saying this hydrogen is from renewable energy, which is really important to giving people confidence that they're decarbonising the economy. Because if you're just using hydrogen that's produced by releasing CO2 in the air, you might as well burn the natural gas or coal.
Okay, Pat's next, and then Pat.
Hi, I'm Pat Rannell, and I'm very interested in trade policy, obviously, but that's already been dealt with. What I wanted to ask about specifically was this. I'm very supportive of policies to have local content in government procurement and in major projects. Australia's just signed up to the WTO procurement agreement, and we've got other procurement chapters in other agreements, which means that we have committed to sort of opening up government procurement as much as possible. Now, there are some exceptions for that for small and medium-sized enterprises, and there's for Aboriginal enterprises and some other specific exceptions. But I just wondered if you could comment on how you can progress a local government, a local content in government procurement policy in that framework.
The answer at the moment is none of this has been tested. So to give you an example, the Victorian government just ran a reverse auction for, I can't remember the exact amount, but a lot of renewable energy. They had a local content requirement of 64% local content. And so that was the minimum you had to meet to be a qualifying tender. Then you got assessed more favourably if you had higher local content. And that's been a real success. No one's challenged that. It'll be interesting if someone does. My impression, certainly in other countries, is that they generally just ignore those provisions. It'll be interesting if anyone challenges it. It's an open question, Pat, to be honest. And I think we should just keep going with our policies and dare someone to say you're doing the wrong thing.
No, I agree, but I think it's an example of how trade agreements can put brakes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, and it reinforces the views of people in central agencies that are neoliberally trained. And the real challenge is good, strong leadership to say, well, here's our agenda, go and do it, please. And it just requires strong political leadership and a willingness not to be cowed by advice mired in the orthodoxy, which is hard sometimes, but we've just got to do it.
Good day, Pat. I'm John Brockman. Problem seems to be that every time we have, well, not every time, it's fair to say, many times when we have a successful enterprise going on in this country, we sell it to overseas concerns. So we don't own a lot of our own manufacturing at all. That's the first point to comment on that, how you could possibly stop that from happening. And the other thing is that with manufacturers or with retailers, cutting down on things like penalty rates and keeping wages low, everybody knows that more money that's going around in the economy, everybody's going to be prosperous. These are educated people. I don't understand their thinking about trying to be mingy with their wages and allowances and everything, because it's signing their own death warrant as well.
Well, on the second part, firstly, thanks for the question. On the second part, I think it's very hard for people to move from their individual circumstances to the collective impact. Like it's not quite the tragedy of the commons, but if people litter, if they just chuck a piece of rubbish out their car, they think, well, there's only one piece of paper. But obviously, if everyone did it, it would be awful for the environment. And I think on penalty rates, small business owners in particular are very focused on their survival. And they don't understand that if everyone does that, then they're not going to have any customers. And that's why I think, we can win that battle. And if you look at the response to our penalty rates campaign, that struck a chord. And the fact that employment hasn't increased in those sectors where penalty rates have been cut in the last year just demonstrates that this is not about increasing employment, it's about attacking people's conditions, and we've just got to be brave on that and be very, very strong on it. And sorry, what was the first part of the question?
The other part was about the fact we keep selling.
Oh, manufacturing, yeah. So one of the huge challenges for local manufacturing is there's a real valley of death in terms of market size, and it's typically when a company needs to move from about $20 million to $200 million, and at that stage they're very vulnerable to being bought up overseas. I know that some trade unions have developed policies in that area, some of them being enacted. So Australian Super has a dedicated manufacturing fund to try and support some of those companies through that. We've looked at policies both in the past, and we've announced a couple in the current government that could play a role. But I think that that is the structural thing, that we're a very small domestic market, and so we have to work very hard to make sure that there are compelling reasons why companies should stay in this country. And one of them is innovation, and I think the automotive industry in reverse demonstrates that, because people said, well, not people, the coalition government said when we lost manufacturing because of their policies, don't worry, we'll keep the brains, the R&D and the engineering. Well, that is going now as well, because there's huge co-location advantages of having R&D and engineering next to manufacturing. And so the example I use is GE. They outsourced all their dishwashers and fridges to China, and they found that it was a nightmare because they were having to send engineers from the US to China every 2 weeks to iron out problems, then come back, then fly out again, when having them located next door meant they could solve problems very quickly. That, as well as their very cheap energy prices, meant that there was a significant reindustrialisation in America. And I think our cheap energy prices, when we get through the energy transition, will be one of those key ways of bringing them back.
On the innovation side of automotive, I think that was always going to happen anyway. I think they only said we're going to keep this here was to keep people happy in the interim period of sort of while everything settles down, and then they were going to go anyway.
Yeah, I think once we lost the manufacturing, because the co-locational benefits are massive, and the deindustrialisation of South Australia has just been a complete disgrace, and I actually think that's their objective. They wanted to destroy industrialised, unionised industries, and they succeeded in it.
John, you want to come back? Okay, last one. We'll make this the last one.
This is a genuine question.
All the others
The US, as you know, the US reportedly the pay rates have gone up. Wages have gone up in the US. Reportedly, much more than it has in Australia, even though both have very low unemployment rates. My question is, does this have anything to do with the crackdown on undocumenteds in the US and the sending of many undocumenteds back to their home countries, and the threat to build a wall and to keep other undocumented out, whether that has had an effect on raising the wage rate of Americans?
The short answer is no, I don't believe so. And in fact, I've seen contradictory evidence about whether US wage rates are increasing. One of the best measures I've seen is actually the measure of comparative wealth, and for everyone but the top sort of 80%, top 20% of American workers, their living standards are the same, if not worse, than in 1972. So there might have been a short-term increase, but I haven't seen that. their standards are declining because of their massive deunionisation and the regressive economic agendas pursued by governments over there. I think here we do have an issue with temporary skilled migration. We've got 1.1 million temporary skilled migrants with various entitlements to work, and some of them have been exploited dreadfully, and some of them are in industries where there isn't adequate labour market testing, and questions have to be asked of that level of temporary skilled migration when you've got 1.8 million Australians who are out of work who want more work. And we've got a real issue with the fact that a lot of Australian employers just won't put their hand in the pocket and train. And when you accompany that with the fact that we've had the privatisation of a lot of government utilities and agencies that did a ton of the apprenticeship training, we've got a skills crisis in this country without a ready solution. So I don't agree with that thesis, and we've got a broader challenge around that. Having said that, permanent migration is something that is the only thing that's holding up our economy. If we didn't have permanent migration increases in the last 5 years, our economy would be in recession.
Okay. Well, I think we might have exhausted the discussion. Please give a warm thank you to Pat Conroy for tonight's presentations.